Yeah, thank you. I think I have another question that sort of comes bringing it back to climate change, sort of gone slightly away from that, but it still relates to large dams. And I think I'd ask Eugene this question. If what we're seeing is that the previous assumptions of river flows, of precipitation, we've been building dams on the basis of these previous assumptions, and what we know is we don't know. We know that it's going to change, we don't know exactly how. Doesn't that in a way make storage through large dams irrelevant now? I would ask Eugene.
You're making, you put it in a kind of a provocative manner.
Deliberately.
No, of course, yeah, I know, I understand. You know, part of the debate is kind of abstract, you know, storage, climate change, adaptation. We have to go back to what John Briscoe said and remember the reason for all of this infrastructure is for poverty reduction, for economic development. I mean, water is a fundamental factor of production in food security, energy security, everything else. So it isn't the way, for example, Zachary Hurwitz put it, which is a dam versus the negative impacts. It's the negative impacts of the environment versus the positive impacts of providing the security and the reliability and robustness and resilience for a nation to be able to develop itself. That's what we should be talking about, not some abstract notion of dam storage versus climate change. And we need to get back to that fundamental discussion. Yes, there are negative impacts for the environment, but what we don't want is to have nations like Ethiopia and Kenya where their GDP is directly proportional, correlated to every flood and drought. We can't have that. That's what dams and storage and infrastructure are for, to provide that extra degree of robustness and buffering capacity against the unknowns of climate change.
I think that, to jump in, I think that the point that you're missing is that dam storage is not the silver bullet solution. I think that's been said already here, and even water transfer schemes. I mean, let's take it down to real examples, as you say that this is such an abstract discussion. I mean, the China South-North Water Transfer Scheme has racked up how much? Over $60 billion worth in costs, displaced 300,000 people over the past years, and still that southern reservoir dries up quite regularly. So, you know, I understand your point, but I think that for international rivers, it's not about the impacts of dams versus the environment, or as you put it. You know, for us, as I mentioned earlier, there are many ways to store water. And to avoid cost overruns, for example, which is a traditional hallmark of the hydropower industry, perhaps the World Bank and other governments, corporations should consider diversifying away from hydropower. I mean, I'd really urge the people on this panel to not see hydropower as the silver bullets, even from the realm of the financial costs. I mean, it's quite expensive, and you know, getting back to the sustainability for sustainable energy for all initiative, and looking at the World Bank's participation over the next few years, you know, some of the projects that have been pitched, for example, the G20 level, the Grand Inga complex, for example. I mean, come on, that is an incredibly expensive project that is rooted in the context of high corruption in Congo. And so I would be slow to say, let's move forward with some of these large hydro schemes without first bringing up country systems to a level in which standards can actually be applied.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here. First, I don't think I thank the organizers, but the trip was worthwhile. No, first, I watched someone from International Rivers say that they're not against dams. And then I saw a World Bank VP say that the World Bank's coming back to dam development. So that paid the trip. But going, no, just not wanting, no, I don't want Zachary to feel alone and displaced here. So, but I do agree with him in the sense that they're not the silver bullet. But one could also argue that large dams are the golden bullet in many, many cases. Let's talk about the case of Brazil. If we are, and we are highly dependent on hydropower production, if we are really to be able to expand on other sources of renewable energies, those that most NGOs would agree are the better solution. I'm not defending they are, but most of the NGOs do say they are, such as wind, biomass, and solar. Every nation, every grid system needs a base production. Those sources of energies, they are not ideal for base production. In our case, a condition to be able to expand quicker on wind and biomass and solar, and by doing so, not having to expand on thermal, fossil fuel type means, we need the reservoirs. The reservoirs are our batteries. No, that's where we can store energy in the form of water when the wind is blowing, when we have biomass to produce, when the sun is shining, so that when that's not taking place, we can produce clean, renewable energy to hydropower. So in a case like Brazil, they're definitely part of solutions. They might not be, Zachary, and I agree, in other nations, in other countries. So they're not a solution for everyone. They're not a solution for everywhere, but they're certainly, undeniably, part of the solution for many. And I think that's what we are talking about here. And I also agree with Eugene. It's not to say that climate change, and with John, it's not in this secondary in the sense that we should not be concerned with. But countries like Uganda and Ethiopia and Pakistan and Brazil have more pressing needs related to the variability of hydrology and climate that we are already facing. So we have to act upon and use the tools we have now while being more holistic and also thinking of future consequences and impacts.
Thank you, Gabriel. I think, John, you wanted to come in?
Just to change the discussion slightly, I think picking up on what Rachel said about finding standards that work for everybody, I think for those of us who are in the World Bank, the last 10 years has been an extraordinary change. And it's an extraordinary change because the economic geography of the world has changed. 10 years ago at the World Bank, when the board met at the World Bank, it was the United States talking, it was Europe talking, it was everybody else sitting and listening to what they said. What we have now in the global economic geography is if China speaks, everybody either has a heart attack or they drop everything to listen to it. If India speaks, they listen. If Brazil speaks, they listen. And this brings, I think, while we have a certain agreement on the things that are in play here, the question is who's making the decisions, and in Rachel's case, who's saying this is a reasonable interpretation of this? Is that going to be a letter from the IRN to the US government, which then says, you must change this because of that, or WWF says, we don't like what Thailand's doing, or is it the countries themselves who are going to make those decisions? Because there is, sorry Zachary, there is no such thing as anything without any impact. And so these are things which are legitimately made by governments that are accountable to their people, and then the role, it seems to me, of organizations like Gabrielle's, a private sector company, the World Bank and others, comes in to say, we respect the decisions broadly that you've made. We think there's some experience to be brought. Rachel mentioned yesterday, if you look, the BNDES in Brazil is a huge funder of these sorts of projects. Yes, they have the same standards, but no, they're much quicker. Sorry, Rachel, they're much quicker. They will make judgment calls instead of these being bureaucratic calls. And I think that's what Rachel is doing a fantastic job. She did in the IFC and she's going to do in the bank, in making those more responsive so that we can do the good things, not just stop the bad things. But the key issue is a governance issue. Who says that? And in the countries that are democratic, respect for the democratically elected governments who have to make trade-offs along these lines. And here I would respectfully ask that Suresh, who has been a minister in the world's biggest democracy, may have something to say on this issue.
Suresh, yes?
You know, first of all, we talk about storages as if this is something new, invention by the mankind himself. The storage have been invented by the nature itself. All the ponds, all the lakes, they have been storages. If nature wanted that no storage was required, probably there would have been raining all the time, throughout the day, throughout the year. But then what would happen to that? The nature realized, probably so nature corrected and realized that it should rain for some time and then there should be some storages available on the ground which can store that water. The problem is that storage, is it sufficient for 7 billion people? And the 7 billion people don't live in a place where the water availability is as high as it's in Latin America. In some countries in the world, like Latin America has got almost 26% of the water, but only 6% of the population. But a country like India, where there's 4% of the water and 17% of the population, or China, which is 22% of the population and just about 7% of the water. So how do you actually manage this? So we really need something to store the water, which is available for a particular period of time and has to be used for a much longer period. And that's why we really need storage. Now, when we need it, the challenge is how to make it in a manner that will be compatible with what nature really desired. And that's possible. We have to do it. Not always most ideal, but something which is more feasible, which is doable, which is practical, and which meets with the requirement at that particular time of that particular geography. And that is what we will need to do. Now, the second challenge is climate change when we talk about it. In fact, I would rather feel that climate change has really put this issue into the fast burner. We really need to look at it completely differently and must put it, the storage, as one of the priorities. Because if there is only one casualty of climate change, that's the water sector. Yeah. There is no other sector which is suffering from because of climate change. And water is required for many things. It's required for environment too. Even our ecosystem cannot survive without water. And therefore, we have many examples in the world where artificial storage of water has sustained an ecosystem. And that's what is very interesting. In fact, one of the very big bird sanctuary in India, Bharatpur, which is actually surviving because of a water body which was created by artificially created lake. So we really need to find out solutions of different kinds. And if we think that we can continue to have more population and could have a same old ideology which can govern that growing population, growing aspiration, I think there is some mismatch there. So we really need to find out what's the best possible solution for a particular geography at a particular time, depending upon all these factors taken into account. So I think nobody can argue that we should try to do something which is against the law of nature. But very fact that we have created so many people which were not there at the beginning of civilization. If there were so many few people like what we had that time, probably we never needed any storage. But we have so many, we have multiple uses, and therefore we'll need to find out.